The Charleston Auction House gleamed under crystal chandeliers, the wood-paneled walls lined with generations of wealth and power. The room smelled of old money and polished floors, filled with well-dressed guests sipping whiskey and scanning leather-bound catalogs. William Hawthorne, 67, sat quietly in the third row. He had attended this event for decades, but not to buy. He no longer cared for pedigrees or trophies. He came for the tradition, or maybe for something he couldn't name. The kind of silence that clings to you after years of burying things too heavy to carry. The auction started like any other. Young thoroughbreds were led across the floor, their coats shimmering like bronze. Bids flew easily. $50, $000, $75,000. Men raising paddles with the same ease they once signed deals on Wall Street. William barely looked up. That changed when the auctioneer hesitated. Her voice dropped slightly. "The next horse is not in the catalog. He was added just this morning." The doors opened slowly. A hush fell. What walked in didn't belong here. The horse was a bay thoroughbred, but he was thin, painfully so. His ribs showed, his coat was dull, and yet his eyes held something no money could buy. "This is Jericho," the auctioneer said. "He was found abandoned near Savannah. Malnourished. Nearly dead. His chip gave us a name, nothing more." William sat upright. Jericho. The name struck him hard, like a note from an old song long forgotten. He stared at the horse. Jericho looked back. Not with fear, not with confusion, but with recognition. As if he had come here for William. As if he knew exactly who was watching him. William rose slowly. He hadn't planned to. His body moved before his mind could catch up. He walked to the edge of the floor, the crowd parting around him like water. Jericho stepped closer too. They met in the center, just a few feet apart. William raised a hand, touched the horse's face. The moment their skin met, something broke loose inside him. Rain. Screaming. A barn. A boy hiding in the dark. And his father, angry, drunk, lashing out at a young bay colt. Jericho had been that colt. And William had watched it all happen. The auctioneer, unsure, cleared her throat. "Would you like to place a bid, sir?" William didn't answer. He was lost in the memory, in the guilt. Jericho wasn't just a horse from the past. He was the past, standing right in front of him, breathing, waiting. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and chandeliers, William realized, the past always finds a way back. Especially when it's not finished with you. The silence didn't break immediately. It lingered in the air, thick and uncomfortable, as if the entire room was holding its breath. William kept his hand on Jericho's face, the warmth of the old horse grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in years. Around them, no one moved. No whispers, no bids, just the weight of something sacred unraveling in the middle of a place built for commerce. Jericho blinked slowly, his eyes never leaving William's. There was no fear in him, no anger either, only memory. And something else. Forgiveness. William stepped back, his hand falling to his side, but his eyes didn't waver. He hadn't thought about that barn in decades. He'd locked it away so tightly that even the smell of hay and rain had been erased from his mind. But Jericho had brought it all back. Not just the whipping. Not just the cruelty. But what came after. The silence. The way his father had walked out like nothing had happened. The way William had stood frozen, too scared to move, too scared to speak. And now, in front of all these people, that little boy inside him stirred for the first time in years. The auctioneer tried to regain control, her voice trembling slightly. Opening bid, $5,000. But no one responded. Their attention was still fixed on William and the horse. This was no longer about money. The energy in the room had shifted. A man in the third row coughed uncomfortably. A woman clutched her pearl necklace. William didn't notice. He was somewhere else entirely, walking back through memories that had dusted over like old furniture in an abandoned room. He remembered the day Jericho disappeared. His father had said he was sold. But William had always suspected otherwise. Something about the way his father avoided the question. He looked at Jericho again, his sunken sides, the faint scars along his hindquarters. This horse had survived more than just neglect. He had been discarded, forgotten. And yet, somehow, he had found his way back. William felt a tremor in his hands. Was it guilt? Or was it relief? Relief that Jericho was still alive, that maybe this moment was his chance to make something right? The crowd shifted again, restless now, sensing the emotional charge building like thunderclouds over a flat plain. Then, without thinking, William raised his hand. 10,000, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The auctioneer froze. A few heads turned sharply. He hadn't placed a bid in over 15 years. The words left his mouth before doubt could take hold. But the second they did, something inside him unlocked, like a door creaking open in a long-abandoned house. And Jericho, still and silent, seemed to understand. His ears twitched. His eyes softened. For the first time in decades, William didn't feel like a boy hiding in the dark. He felt seen. And maybe forgiven. The gavel never fell. Not immediately. The auctioneer held it mid-air, eyes bouncing between William and the silent room, unsure whether to complete the sale or wait for someone to challenge the bid. But no one spoke. No one dared. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in William himself. As he returned to his seat, he wasn't the same man who had walked into the hall that evening. He was heavier now, not with regret, but with memory. The weight of remembering something you've spent your life trying to forget can be far greater than the guilt itself. Jericho was led away gently by a young stable hand, but not before glancing back one last time. William caught it. That subtle pause, the flick of an ear, the soft snort. It wasn't dramatic, but it meant something. He watched as the horse disappeared behind a pair of swinging doors, and with him, the thin thread that had tethered William to the present snapped again. He wasn't in the auction hall anymore. He was back on the family farm. A teenager now, watching from the upstairs window as a trailer pulled away at dawn. No explanation. No goodbye. His father had told him Jericho had been sold to someone who knew what they were doing. But even then, William hadn't believed him. Later that night, after the auction ended and the crowd had thinned, William waited by the stables. He wasn't ready to leave. Not without seeing Jericho again. The staff moved quietly around him, recognizing him, but giving him space. Everyone knew William Hawthorne's name. Fewer knew his story. And no one knew why he was standing outside stall number 14, gripping the railing with white knuckles, staring at a horse he hadn't seen in over 5 decades. Jericho stood quietly inside, head low, eyes half closed. But when William whispered his name, the ears twitched. He opened the stall slowly, stepping inside like he was entering a sacred space. There was no fear between them. Only something heavier. Something unspoken. William placed a hand on the horse's neck, feeling the rise and fall of breath. The silence wrapped around them like an old blanket, worn, familiar, comforting in its sadness. "I thought you were dead," he said softly. "I thought he killed you." Jericho blinked, slow and patient, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for the truth. Then, behind him, a voice he hadn't heard in years sliced through the dark. "Some things should have stayed buried, William." The voice was rough, aged, and unmistakable. William turned slowly. His breath caught. It was his older brother, James. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The space between William and his brother James felt wider than the stall door, wider than the 50 years that had passed without a single phone call. James leaned against the stable wall, arms crossed, a faint limp in his posture. The years hadn't been kind to him, but the defiance in his eyes hadn't aged a day. William couldn't bring himself to speak right away. The sound of Jericho's slow breathing behind him seemed louder now, like the horse knew this moment wasn't meant to be easy. "I didn't think you'd ever come back," James finally said, his voice cold, flat. "Not after what happened. Not after you left everything behind." William exhaled, the air heavy in his lungs. "I didn't leave. I escaped," he replied. "You know damn well what that place became." James pushed off the wall, stepping closer. "We all knew. But you were the only one who ran." The words landed like punches, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. William had buried his pain beneath years of silence, work, and distance. But James had stayed. He had endured. And now the resentment showed in every line on his weathered face. William turned back toward Jericho, his fingers grazing the thin mane. "I thought he was gone," he said softly. "I thought Father put him down that night." James's expression shifted. Not softer, just different. "He almost did. But I got there first. Took him before the vet arrived. Drove all night and left him with an old trainer up in Kentucky. I didn't know what else to do. I was 16. William froze. "You saved him?" James nodded. "Someone had to." The silence between them turned from anger to something deeper. Regret, maybe. Understanding. William looked at his brother for the first time, really looked at him. James had carried the burden William had dropped, and somehow he had protected the very thing William thought he'd lost forever. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" William asked, voice cracking. James gave a tired laugh. "Would you have listened?" he said. "You were gone before the dust even settled." The words stung, but they weren't meant to wound. They were just honest. William stepped out of the stall, standing beside his brother under the dim light of the stable. "I didn't come here to find him," he said. "I came here because I didn't know where else to go." James glanced at Jericho, then back at William. "Well," he said quietly, "maybe he knew where you needed to be." And in that stillness, between the smell of hay and the weight of shared silence, the past didn't feel quite so far away. The next morning came slowly, wrapped in gray skies and the quiet drip of dew off the barn roof. William hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting outside Jericho's stall, watching the rise and fall of the horse's chest in the dim light. James hadn't stayed. After their conversation, he'd simply nodded and walked off into the darkness, leaving William with more questions than answers. There were things unsaid, decades worth, and the silence left behind was nearly unbearable. William stood, his knees stiff, and stretched his aching back. That's when he noticed the old saddle box in the corner of the stable. It was battered, almost invisible under a dusty blanket and some unused tack. But something about it called to him. He opened the lid slowly, the hinges groaning like they hadn't moved in years. Inside, folded neatly and wrapped in twine, was a letter. Yellowed, weathered, addressed in careful cursive, to William. His chest tightened. He hesitated before touching it, as though it might disappear the moment he acknowledged it. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he untied the string and opened the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was his mother's. He hadn't seen it in over 40 years, not since the funeral. The letter was dated just a few weeks before she died. His eyes scanned the first lines, and suddenly, the world shrank to the paper in his hands. "I know the house has been filled with shadows. I see it in your eyes, even when you try to hide it. You were always the one with a heart too big for silence." That's why I'm writing this now. In case I don't get the chance to say it face to face. William swallowed hard. The words blurred. She had known. All those years, he thought she'd been unaware, lost in her own quiet suffering. But she'd seen everything. Your father was raised in darkness, he never escaped, she continued. But you, William, were born with light. I hope one day you come home, not to him, but to yourself. By the time he finished reading, tears had spilled onto the paper. He clutched it like something sacred, his knuckles white with the effort to keep it steady. Jericho stirred behind him, snorting softly as if sensing the storm inside the man who once left him behind. William looked at the horse, older now, but still standing. Still breathing. Still here. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. Something inside him had shifted. He wasn't just visiting the past anymore. He was finally starting to face it. Later that afternoon, William drove back to the old family farm. The long gravel road felt narrower than he remembered, lined with sagging fences and overgrown weeds. The trees that once looked tall and proud now stood like tired sentinels, guarding the past rather than welcoming it. He hadn't seen the place since the day he left for college, and never looked back. The truck slowed as he approached the barn. Its red paint had faded into a dull, blistered memory, and the roof sagged in places, but it still stood. Still waiting. William parked and sat in silence for a moment, staring at the structure like it might reach out and pull him inside. The moment he stepped through the barn doors, the smell hit him. Dust, leather, and something else. Time. The same stalls, the same beams, the same creaky floorboards under his boots. Everything was familiar and foreign all at once. There were still bits of rope hanging from old nails, a rusted feed bucket in the corner, and broken halters in a pile near the wall. He ran his hand along a stall door, the wood rough and cold. This was where it happened. This was where Jericho had stood that night, trembling and bleeding under the fury of a man who never learned how to love. William found the back room unlocked. It was where his father used to keep records, tools, and whatever secrets he didn't want others to see. The drawers were mostly empty now, but in the bottom cabinet, beneath some rotted saddle blankets, he found something unexpected, a journal. Old leather, cracked and worn. He opened it carefully. Inside, page after page of his father's handwriting. Neat. Controlled. Clinical. It wasn't the writing of a cruel man. It was the writing of a broken one. Notes about training methods, animal behavior, and, oddly, short, stiff entries that read more like confessions than reflections. The boy sees too much. He feels too much. I don't know how to raise that kind of softness into a man. William sat on the dusty floor, journal in hand, the barn around him pressing in like a closing book. He flipped through more pages, the words growing less rigid, more uncertain. Regret was there, in between the lines, unspoken but undeniable. The man who raised him may never have said, "I'm sorry." But now, after all these years, William could feel it. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the grass like whispers. William stood, tucking the journal under his arm. He no longer needed answers from the past. He needed to decide what to do with the future. Back at the stables in Charleston, the evening sun spilled golden light across the paddocks, casting long shadows that danced over the quiet earth. Jericho stood alone in the far corner of the field, head low, tail flicking lazily. William watched him from behind the fence, the letter from his mother still folded in his pocket, and the old journal resting on the seat of his truck. Everything felt heavier now, but not in a way that crushed him. In a way that demanded something new. A decision. A step forward. The past had spoken. Now it was his turn to answer. James arrived a few minutes later, stepping out of an old pickup with 2 coffees in hand. He offered one without a word. William accepted it. They stood side by side, the silence between them not as thick as before. "So," James finally said, "what are you gonna do with him?" William didn't respond right away. He watched Jericho, his bony frame backlit by the last warmth of the sun. "I thought maybe I'd take him home," he said. James raised an eyebrow. "Back to Beaufort?" William nodded. "Yeah, to the farm." James let out a slow breath. "You sure? That place has ghosts." William gave a small, almost sad smile. "They've already followed me this far. Might as well let them settle." He sipped the coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. "Besides, that barn deserves better than what it became. Maybe Jericho does too." James stared at him for a moment, then looked back at the horse. "You're not doing this for him," he said quietly. "You're doing it for yourself." William didn't argue, because he knew it was true. The next morning, the trailer door creaked open and Jericho stepped inside, slow but steady. The vet had warned him, the horse wouldn't have many years left. But that didn't matter. It wasn't about how long Jericho had, it was about how it ended. William tightened the straps, spoke to him gently, and closed the trailer gate. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was returning, carrying not just a horse, but the last missing piece of himself. As the truck pulled out of the lot and back onto the quiet highway, William caught a glimpse of Jericho through the side mirror. Still, calm, patient, the same way he had waited all those years, not just to be saved, but to be seen. And now, finally, he was. Some journeys don't begin until you've come home first. The truck rolled up the gravel path of the old Hawthorne farm just as the sun began to dip behind the tree line. The house hadn't changed much. Peeling paint, sagging porch, windows clouded with time. But the barn, after all these years, looked even smaller than William remembered. He parked near the entrance and stepped out slowly, the soft chirp of crickets rising in the warm air. The last time Jericho had been here, he was a colt trembling beneath a leather strap. Now, he returned as a survivor. And William wasn't sure what he was anymore. But he knew he wasn't the same man who'd driven away all those years ago. He opened the trailer and Jericho stood still, taking in the air, the silence, the scent of the earth. "We're home," William whispered. The horse blinked slowly. No rush, no panic, just presence. William stepped aside, and Jericho walked out, slow, measured, his hooves pressing into the familiar dirt like he remembered. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. The barn door creaked as it opened, the hinges still complaining after all these years. Inside, the dust swirled in the last rays of sun. William had cleared out the broken boards and laid down fresh straw the day before. He had fixed the stall himself, alone. Every nail driven with intention, with apology. Jericho stepped inside and let out a low, deep exhale. It wasn't fear. It was something older than fear. Memory. William leaned on the stall door and watched him settle in. He'd expected emotion, maybe tears. But what came was quiet. A deep, aching quiet that filled the space between the past and the present. For the first time in a long while, the barn felt still, not haunted, not angry. Just still. And that was enough. The next days passed like chapters in a slow novel. William woke with the sun, fed Jericho by hand, brushed the dust from his coat, walked him through the field. They didn't move fast. Jericho's body was worn, and William's wasn't far behind. But it wasn't about speed. It was about rhythm, about presence. And in those silent mornings, with birds calling in the trees and dew clinging to the grass, something began to rebuild, not just between man and horse, but within the man himself. He found himself walking into the house again, room by room, sweeping out years of dust and memory. He opened windows that had been shut for decades. Let in air. Let in light. He didn't rush. He just moved. one quiet step at a time. Sometimes, healing doesn't come loud. Sometimes, it sounds like hooves in straw and the breath of something that waited long enough to be loved again. The days slipped by in a quiet rhythm. William kept to a routine. Simple, honest. He fed Jericho each morning, walked him along the fence line, spoke to him as if he were an old friend rather than a ghost from a life once buried. The horse listened. Or maybe he just stood there, breathing slowly, anchoring William to the present. Either way, it was enough. The farm, once a place of silence and shame, now breathed differently. The air was lighter. The windows were open. The fields were starting to look like someone cared again. Even the birds seemed to sing louder, or maybe William had just finally learned how to listen. One morning, James showed up unannounced. He brought a small bag of tools and a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Figured I'd help you fix the front porch before it collapses," he muttered. William didn't argue. They worked side by side, mostly in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that divided, it was the kind that stitched something back together. During a break, James leaned against the railing, wiping sweat from his brow. "You know," he said, "he waited for you. Every day. After you left. Mom too. She kept the porch light on for months." William stared out at the pasture, heart heavier than he'd expected. "I didn't think I was worth waiting for," he admitted. James didn't say anything. He just handed William another nail. That afternoon, Jericho stumbled. It was small, barely noticeable, but William saw it. The way his leg gave just slightly on the incline. The way he paused before stepping into the barn. That night, the vet confirmed what he had feared deep down. Jericho's body was giving out. Years of wear, trauma, and time had taken their toll. "He's tired," the vet said softly. "You've given him peace. That might be the most anyone could ask for." William nodded, unable to speak. He stayed in the barn that night, resting beside the stall, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Jericho's breathing. As the sun rose, painting the fields in gold, William sat with his hand gently resting on Jericho's neck. The horse didn't move much anymore, but his eyes were still clear, still present. William whispered stories, memories he hadn't spoken aloud in decades. Of his mother's laughter, of warm cornbread on the kitchen table, of summer nights chasing fireflies. He spoke until his voice cracked, until there was nothing left but silence and the sound of breath. Sometimes goodbye doesn't come with thunder or tears. Sometimes it arrives like a sunrise, quiet, slow, and full of light. And William knew. The final moment was near. Jericho passed quietly in the early hours of the morning. There was no struggle, no sound, just a final breath that slipped out like a soft exhale in the cold. William sat beside him, one hand resting gently against the horse's neck, eyes closed. He didn't cry. The tears had come days earlier, when he realized what this journey had really been about. It wasn't just about saving Jericho. It was about saving the part of himself he'd abandoned the day he left this place. And now, with Jericho gone, something strange filled the air. Not sorrow. Not loss. Something more like peace. James arrived just after sunrise, already knowing. He didn't ask questions. He didn't offer clichés. He simply brought a shovel. Together, they dug beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture, the spot where their mother used to sit and read when they were boys. It was hard work, slow and heavy. But neither of them complained. When the grave was ready, they wrapped Jericho in an old blanket from the barn and laid him to rest. James stood in silence, his hat in his hands. William spoke quietly. "You carried more than you should have, brother. I'm sorry." James didn't look up, but he nodded. "You came back. That's enough." Over the next few weeks, the farm came alive in quiet ways. William sanded the porch steps, one by one. He repaired the window frames, repainted the barn doors in a deep, calm red. James helped most days. They didn't talk much, but their silence had shifted again. It was no longer heavy, it was comfortable. The kind of silence that comes when words are no longer needed. At night, William read his mother's letter again. Sometimes twice. The journal stayed by his bed, not for the guilt it once carried, but for the strange comfort of knowing that even flawed men can leave behind something honest. One evening, after the sun dipped low, William sat on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, one in his hand, one placed on the empty chair beside him. The breeze moved softly through the trees. He looked out toward the pasture, where fireflies flickered like old memories dancing in the dark. He imagined Jericho running, not the tired old horse, but the young colt from all those years ago. Free. Unafraid. Some goodbyes aren't endings. They're beginnings disguised in softer light. The kind of light that stays long after the sun sets. And for the first time in his life, William didn't feel alone.